So, in the last session, we looked at the notion of anxiety. And I talked about anxiety as a type of experience we have when we live between things. And in particular, I looked at the idea of the anxiety that exists between knowing and unknowing. And I talked about how we can often try to escape this anxiety by either fleeing towards some worldview that promises to have the ultimate answer, or by renouncing the entire pursuit and seeing it as some sort of fool's errand. So using the work of C.S. Lewis and Paul Tillich, I looked at this idea of a third way. Now, the third way wasn't some in-between that exists between knowing and unknowing. It isn't some sort of agnosticism, but rather it is a form of embracing both at the same time. And one of the examples I used was the idea of two people arguing about what truth is. In order to even have the argument, we already have to presuppose truth. So it's not so much that we argue to truth, we argue from it. We are arguing about something we already stand within. So any conclusions we come to about the notion of truth will be fragmented, will be open to change and open to challenge. But those theories themselves somehow rest on a deeper ground. In this way, truth is attested to in the very seeking of truth. Our very pursuit of the answer is evidence of the answer. Now, Tillich develops a very subtle and sophisticated religious theory that explores how faith is a type of discourse that protects us from two extremes. On the one extreme, we have a type of empty, relativistic, scientific discourse. And on the other, we have a type of occultic, supernaturalist, absolutist, idolatrous discourse. On one side, we've renounced any notion of the truth, and in the other, we arrogantly think we've grasped it. In contrast, Tillich explores this notion of ultimate concern, in which we need to be taken up in causes. We need to give ourselves over to what we believe is right, all the while having humility and openness to being wrong, committing ourselves with fear and trembling. In this way, faith invites us to embrace and celebrate a type of existence that doesn't lose unknowing in knowing, or knowing in unknowing, but that helps us to somehow embrace and affirm the struggle that these two poles create within us. In this session, I want to talk about a different type of anxiety. An anxiety not between knowing and unknowing, but between having and not having. A type of anxiety that creates desire. Now, the issue here is that we tend to want to grasp something that will fill our desire. We have a tendency to believe that there is something out there that will make us whole and complete in this life or the next. It might be a relationship, it might be money, it might be fame, it might be a certain religious idea, but there's something that can stop up our desire and get rid of this frenetic pursuit that we have. Now, the problem we face is that if we don't get this thing, then we end up being depressed. But on the other side, there's another traumatic experience. And that's when we actually do get the thing that we think will make us whole and complete. Because it's only when we fulfill our dreams that we realize our dreams do not fulfill us. If we think a certain amount of money is going to get rid of this existential experience of lack, then we'll realize that it doesn't work and we'll have to double the amount that we want. If we think a certain job or a certain person is going to make us happy and whole, then if we ever get that, we realize that we're left with a shadow. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek used the analogy of creationism to help us understand this. He said that for some creationists, fossils were put there by God to make the earth look old. So fossils are the remains of something that never actually existed. And Zizek says that this is what this object is like for us. It's called Object A. Object A is the object that you think will fix everything. He says it's just like a fossil in creationism. When you get it, all you have is this dead set of remains of something that doesn't actually exist. We fantasize that it will bring satisfaction, and that's what it promises. But all it produces within us is dissatisfaction. This is why the philosopher Schopenhauer said that we live in a pendulum swing between boredom and pain. There is the pain of not getting what we want, and there is the boredom of getting what we want. One of the ways that this is described in psychoanalysis is the difference between the object of desire and the object cause of desire. The object of desire is what you want, and the object cause of desire is the barriers and the obstacles that get in the way. So for example, if you want a new car and you really, really want this car, and you go to all the showrooms and you do test drives, you look at the magazines, you do all of this research, you save up your money, then you finally get the car, and there's a sense of disappointment after maybe a week or two. And then perhaps you realize that actually all of the things that were getting in the way of you having the car were actually what was generating the desire for the car. It was going through the magazines, doing the test drive, saving up the money. The thing that you thought was getting in the way of getting what you wanted was actually the very thing that generated your desire for it. So when you get the object of desire, you lose the object cause of desire, and therefore you no longer desire what you desire. Hence, we often dream about certain forms of life that we would like when we're older. And then if we get them, we find that they don't satisfy us, because actually it was the challenges to get there that was what generated all of the pleasure and all of the enjoyment. I'll give you a concrete example of this in relationships. So I'm going to give you an example of something that happens a lot. I'm going to call this couple Jack and Jill. Now, Jack and Jill have been married for 10 years, and the desire has slowly dissipated from their relationship. Well, one day, Jack meets this other woman, we'll call her Snow White, and they fall deeply in love. And he wants to be with Snow White, and he always says that he wants to be with her, but he can't because of his marriage, his commitments, his children. Well, anyway, eventually this is found out. Jill discovers the affair. They have a massive argument, and Jill says, "You've got to leave." Jack is absolutely fine about that. The relationship's dead anyway. But then something weird happens. A week passes, and Jack is no longer interested in Snow White. Jack is now interested in Jill, and Jill, although she's angry with Jack, really desires him. And they find themselves again in the heat of passion, just like when they first met. Now, if you were an alien from outer space, this would seem very strange to you. This couple lacked desire for each other. Jack finds somebody else. Jill says you can leave and be with her. So we would expect that Jack would go off with Snow White, Jill would go off and find someone herself. So why does that rarely happen? Well, in this example, you could say that Jack is an obsessive and Jill is an hysteric. An obsessive is someone who really only desires what's impossible, what they don't have, what they can't have, what their friend has. And so Jack desires Snow White because it's impossible. There's this obstacle, his whole family, that stops him from being with her. But once the obstacle's removed, the fantasy dissipates and he's like, no, of course I don't want to be with you. And now the obstacle is between him and his wife, Jill, and he starts to desire her again. Now for Jill, she can only desire what is under threat of being taken away. So her jealousy is evoked by Snow White. And as the jealousy is evoked, so is her desire for Jack. So while they both probably dislike each other, they both are going to be arguing, their underlying desire for each other has never been so strong. And the truth is, many couples go through this cycle many times. What they're frantically trying to do is bring the object of desire and the object cause of desire into the same location. Now, what has all this got to do with Simone Weil and this idea of Aesop's miser? Well, interestingly, Simone Weil, in her book Gravity and Grace, asked this question: what does the miser lose when he loses his treasure? And she's no doubt thinking about Aesop's fable of the miser who never spends his treasure but just counts it every week, and whose treasure is stolen by a thief. Now, the question that Simone Weil brings up is, why is this miser so sad? He never used the treasure. He was never going to use the treasure. So in some way, he didn't lose anything. In fact, that's what the neighbor implies whenever he throws some rocks into the hole and says, count those, it'll do you as much good. But there is something that the miser loses, because he is deeply upset. And this is where Simone Weil has this beautiful insight. She says that the miser has found a way of getting satisfaction from living between having and not having. The treasure is a type of quantum indeterminacy in which he neither has it nor loses it, and finds some sort of pleasure in that space. We could call this a type of Schrodinger's treasure. Now, the reason why I call this Schrodinger's treasure is because of the famous thought experiment in physics called Schrodinger's cat, in which a cat is placed in a metal box, and the metal box is closed. And in this metal box is some poisonous gas. In addition to that, there is a small radioactive particle in the box and a Geiger counter to measure it. And the whole point of the thought experiment is this, is that supposedly subatomic particles have a type of superpositioning. They don't crunch into a particular position until they're observed. And so this particle that is within the box has a 50% chance of degrading and a 50% chance of not degrading. But technically, until it's observed, it's in superposition. So it's both degraded and not degraded at the same time. And if it degrades, the poisonous gas is released and the cat's killed. And if it doesn't degrade, the gas is not released. So technically, until we open the box and look inside, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. Right? So in a similar way, this miser has a treasure that he both has and doesn't have at the same time. And in this space of quantum indeterminacy, he finds satisfaction. Now, Simone Weil says that's how desire works. There has to be a type of having and not having. And one of the problems with the miser is that he has an unstable form of maintaining desire. The treasure can be stolen or it can be used. Simone Weil says that we need a more stable form of this. And that's the place of religion. This is the place of faith. Now, I'll give you an example in daily life before I go on to what Simone Weil says about faith. If you take the idea of courtly love, amour courtois, which is where our notion of love comes from, which is from a notion in medieval France, where poets would write about a lady who was married to a lord, but who was in love with a knight. And the knight, in turn, was devoted to and in love with the lady. And in these poems, you would read about how the knight would dedicate his entire life to the lady and do all of these great tasks for her. And they could never be together, and yet they were completely intertwined. There was a golden thread that linked them. They both experienced each other's presence and absence at the same time. And this gave them both a sense of meaning, purpose, and depth within life. For Simone Weil, desire doesn't just bring meaning and depth to our lives. It is central to our subjectivity. It is central to being human. And faith is a language and a practice that keeps this experience of desire alive within us. God is a type of presence that is absence, something that we cannot run from and cannot grasp, something that satisfies and is dissatisfying. Simone Weil doesn't argue for the existence of God, but rather for the need of something that keeps the space of desire open. And faith is central to that task. If we take the example of the crucifixion, Christ is the object cause of desire, the thing that's getting in the way of God. So we want to crucify Christ to get back to God. But we realize that the object cause of desire is the object of desire. In other words, the obstacle to God is God. We also see this in Saul's conversion. Saul is persecuting this small group called the Christians who are getting in the way of the true religion. They are the obstacle that must be gotten rid of. And yet Paul has the insight through this voice that says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he realizes that the obstacle to the divine is the divine. The object of desire and the object cause of desire, far from being in two different places, are brought together in one and the same place. So for Simone Weil, like Søren Kierkegaard, there is something about faith that is about embracing contradiction. A type of contradiction that is not anxiety producing, but life-giving. Now there's different names for this contradiction in different areas of life. In biology, it's called evolution. Evolution is the idea that an organism is not at one with its environment or itself, and this contradiction is what breeds complexity. In physics, as we've just looked at, it's called quantum indeterminacy, that being itself is not at one, and this is what generates everything in the universe. In mathematics, it's called the incompleteness theorem, where mathematics has a type of contradiction hard baked into it, which is what gives it its life, that it cannot prove its own axioms without falling into contradiction. In politics, this is called democracy, where the social body is not one, and that not oneness generates a democratic process that helps civilization. And in religion, for Simone Weil, this is something about the very heart of conversion, entering into this space in which we live in the struggle. In this way, the person of faith is a bit like the scientist whose love for truth is what fuels their pursuit of truth, whose dissatisfaction in their answers provides a certain form of satisfaction. Final example I want to use is from the Bible, and it's the parable of the pearl of great price. Now, on the surface, this is a very simple economic parable. It makes total sense. Somebody finds a parable that is priceless. They sell their possessions to own this priceless pearl. And yet that's complete insanity. Because if all you own is the pearl, then even though you might be the richest person in the world, you don't have any money to buy anything. You can only have money if you sell the pearl. And so we find in this parable a beautiful analogy of what Simone Weil is talking about. That somehow in the richness there is poverty. That somehow in the having there is not having. And this gets us to the heart of what it means to have faith.